Hey guys, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Hebrew literature. This is from your reading, basically in the book, but a little extra added in there. Also, I hate my voice recorded, so if this sounds awkward, that's why. First of all, the Hebrews, otherwise known as the Jews, they were wanderers. And because of that, they didn't leave behind a great deal of monuments or anything else dedicated to their culture. But they did have a rich cultural life based on their religious beliefs. And these led to the Hebrew Bible, as we know it, the Old Testament. And this is a record of their spiritual, literary, and historical experience. So while it's a deeply religious work, it really expresses the Hebrew culture, and we've come to take it as part of our own religion in Christianity. Next, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the early Hebrew patriarchs, and the first is Abraham, or Abram, and his wife, Sarai, or Sarah. They lived in the area of Mesopotamia, and they moved from Babylonia for Canaan, and this is an area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Abram's name was changed to Abraham. Abraham means father of many, and Sarai's name was changed to Sarah, which means mother of nations. So this really sets them up to be patriarchs for a greater society. Their descendants are called Hebrews, and that means people from across the river. They have a child named Isaac, who in turn has a child named Jacob, and he is the father of 12 sons who become the basis for the 12 tribes of Israel. God changed Jacob's name to Israel, and the meaning of that is wrestles with God, something like that. And I think that really speaks to the way people in general have a relationship with faith and God, that sometimes it's a struggle. But because his name was changed, the Hebrews became known also as the Israelites, and the nation of Israel comes from this root as well. And Hebrew numerology, 12 may be the number of completion. Numerology is important in a lot of societies, and you may be familiar with the number 3 being important to ours. Things come in threes. 3 also is the number of completion for us, and so in this way, I think that it makes sense that 12 is that number for the Hebrews. Now, one of Jacob's sons was named Joseph, and you may remember the story of the coat of many colors. Jacob was sold into slavery by his brothers because of their jealousy. He was Isaac's favorite, and he ends up in Egypt. In Egypt, he predicts that a famine is coming, and so the Pharaoh favors him and kind of elevates him from slavery. And as a result of this famine, he brings the Israelites to Egypt to save them, because the Egyptians were prepared where the people in Canaan were not. So over the years, though, the Israelites as a cultural group were enslaved by the Egyptians. And so for many years, they are slaves. Now, here's an important piece of the puzzle for them getting out of Egypt: Moses. I'm sure you all remember the story of Moses. He, as a baby, was hidden in the reeds and was found by Pharaoh's daughter and saved, etc., etc. But as an adult, he led the Israelites in Exodus to freedom into the Sinai desert. So 40 years they wandered the desert, and they were headed toward Canaan, which they believed was the promised land to the Hebrews. And they believed that God would lead them to this. An important part of their covenant with God that happens here is the Ten Commandments. Obviously, you have heard about these Ten Commandments for a very long time, but it's also called Mosaic Law, obviously after Moses. So unfortunately, he never saw the Israelites back in Canaan, but Joshua did, and he eventually leads the Israelites back there into the Promised Land. But at this point, it's been a long time since they've been there, so obviously other people live there now. At this point, it's inhabited by the Canaanites and the Philistines. Also, there's struggle between the 12 different tribes, and it's during this time that they need to kind of organize themselves, and they do that with Judges, and that's a book of the Bible that talks about the rules and laws, or part of it deals with that at this time. So Judges help to establish order between the tribes, and from that period rose a leader named Saul. Better call Saul. No, not that guy. Saul is the first king of Israel, and this is about 1020 BC. He leads the Israelites to be the most powerful group in Canaan, but they never really gain complete control over the Philistines. You are probably familiar with that word, but the Romans called the Canaans the Palestinians, or they called that area Canaan, Palestine, which is a name that persists today, and the struggle between Israel and Palestine has gone on all the way up until our modern time today. As a continuance of this unification, King David rises to power, and he brought a real era of peace and stability to the Israelites. And he began a period of roughly 100 years of prosperity for them. And to top it all off, he captured the area that we now know as Jerusalem from the Philistines, making it the hub of the Hebrew society. His son Solomon reigned during the height of this era of stability, and he brings about an era of beautification. So when, a society is at its height, they focus on, establishing monuments that serve as a reminder of all of the things of their culture. So one of the things he undertook was the Temple of Jerusalem, and this represented Hebrew spirituality. It was their spiritual center, and eventually it's destroyed. And all that remains of that is the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem today. There have been talks of, rebuilt temples and, prophecies coming to fruition with a new building of the temple, but the temple of Jerusalem that Solomon built was destroyed. So after Solomon's death, there was another period of conflict and division, and the 12 tribes break apart. You've got Judah to the south. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin move here, and that's where the word Judea or Jew comes from. Jerusalem is in this area. Then you have Israel to the north, or Samaria, and that's the 10 remaining tribes. But although there were more tribes to the north, they were very prone to attack. So those tribes were absorbed into the surrounding cultures and called the 10 lost tribes. Judah or Judea was also conquered. Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah, destroyed the temple, drove the Hebrews into slavery in Babylon. This is known as the Babylonian exile. Even with this invasion and exile, the spiritual and cultural connections of the Hebrews kept their culture and their society alive.
By the rivers of Babylon, where he sat down, and there
So when the Persians invaded Babylon years later, the Persians ended up freeing the Hebrews. Some Hebrews returned to Jerusalem, and some stayed in Babylonia. And this is where we get a scattering of the Jewish nation, and hence a movement away from Jerusalem and into other areas. Even though they were freed, they were still under foreign rule in Jerusalem. So regarding Hebrew identity in the Bible, the one thing that stands out for the Hebrews is Yahweh, God. They believed in monotheism, and that created a unity culturally for them. And it's also different in that the covenant that they established is different than other cultures. The covenant was an agreement with God to protect the people if they lived his law. And this kind of agreement hadn't really been seen before. We are going to look at the Bible as a creation story like the others that we looked at, even though it's something that we hold with such religious importance to us. The part of the Bible that we're looking at is the Old Testament to us, but to the Hebrews is the Tanakh. It encompasses the book of law, which is the Torah. It also encompasses a book of prophets and a book of writings. The Torah, again, contains Genesis and those first few books that lay out the law. And Genesis is a Greek word, just so you know. Prophets were social and spiritual reformers, not like fortune tellers. Maybe you can equate them to social activists, but they were important in telling the masses what needed to be evaluated in society. And then lastly, writings contain things like Psalms, which are hymns of praise, and you know that from Mass, and more literary components to the Hebrew writings. Themes that are explored in the Hebrew Bible include their relationship with Yahweh, his promises and demands, and the fact that humans are tested, but God is still merciful. So he continues to guide his people even though they are flawed. These are some of the aspects that we're going to talk about in the creation story as presented in Genesis. And we're going to talk about those common themes and attributes of the creation myth because they can be seen in this too.